Now, ever since the Andor series came out, it has sparked some rather interesting discussions and debates within the Star Wars fanbase, some of them even centering around the validity of the show itself, with some fans saying it's not real Star Wars, or not what Star Wars should be, that it's lacking in fun and it's too dark and gritty, too slow-paced, and too boring. While others will argue that it's not only some of the best Star Wars ever, but that in some ways it is as real as Star Wars has ever been or felt, which is good and refreshing, that they enjoy the more grounded approach and find themselves on the edge of their seats filled with tension as they watch each and every single episode. And this discussion has sort of resurfaced or intensified with the release of the first episode of Season 3 of The Mandalorian, an episode that many seem to think wasn't, shall we say, the most impressive of season openers ever, and that it was by no means a gem in terms of writing, especially when indeed compared to something like, well, pretty much any given episode of Andor. There are even those who are saying, or who were saying leading up to this season, that they weren't so sure they'd be able to look at the show, at The Mandalorian, the same way anymore, that Andor's writing had potentially spoiled them or opened their eyes, that it had pulled back the curtain in a sense and revealed just how good and well-written a Star Wars show can and should be. Especially after they were maybe a bit disappointed in things like the Book of Boba Fett and Kenobi, the latter of which some think should have taken a more Andor tone or feel in its approach, a more serious and grounded and introspective story that focused more so on Kenobi himself and his personal struggles, and less on the other characters and the build-up to fighting Darth Vader yet again, which, let's be honest, was the real point of the series, to give us the rematch of the century spectacle that would sell Disney Plus subscriptions. Anyway, getting back to The Mandalorian and the quality level of its writing, well, there are those who will say that The Mandalorian is intentionally not written as well as something like Andor, that it's meant to harken back to the original Star Wars film, which was based on the serialized shows like Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers that George Lucas grew up with, among other things, of course. That its more fun and simplistic approach to storytelling, you could call it, is part of its charm and makes it feel more like authentic Star Wars, because good, authentic Star Wars isn't necessarily well written. It tends to be a bit more fun, light, and campy, I guess, or according to some people. I've even had someone recently say to me that what makes The Mandalorian so good is the fact that it's written so poorly, like pretty much all of Star Wars is. And don't get me wrong, I don't think that's indicative of how most people think of or would try and defend the show's writing. I think most people who enjoy it would simply say it's not meant to be like Andor, but that doesn't make the writing automatically bad, which I do agree with. I don't think The Mandalorian is poorly written as much as I think it's just not trying to be the same thing as Andor, and vice versa. I mean, they're quite clearly setting out with some very different goals in mind regarding what they want to be and accomplish with their stories, though yes, both are still trying to be good Star Wars in their own right, which, in my opinion, is not only okay, but I firmly believe that Star Wars can and should try to capture many different tones, depending on either the story it's telling or the audience it is aiming for. That even though George Lucas has always maintained it's a franchise primarily for children, that he made it for them initially, it's okay given just how many adult fans there are, especially given it's now a 45-year-old franchise, that sometimes it takes on a more mature nature or feeling like Andor did, as long as it never goes all in on that and stops producing content that's more inviting to younger audiences or audiences of all ages. I'd even argue that varying tones and approaches is very much essential for keeping the franchise feeling fresh and surviving long-term, and bringing in new fans from across the board, that as much as I and many fans love it, not everything should strive to feel exactly like that very first Star Wars film. Especially when you consider the second Star Wars film, The Empire Strikes Back, it didn't even set out to do that. It didn't try to replicate everything about that first film. In fact, you could argue there's almost a night and day difference in tone between it and that first Star Wars film, and yet, despite being radically different in many respects, plenty of fans and critics regard it as the best Star Wars film of all time, and we can certainly ask where would the franchise be today if not for The Empire Strikes Back. Also, keep in mind that the prequel trilogy did not strive to be just like the original trilogy all over again. It very much has its own unique feel, though still, I'd argue, feels like Star Wars overall, though there are certainly fans who would argue against that and didn't enjoy those films. Another thing to keep in mind is that George Lucas complained that The Force Awakens didn't do anything new, that it was essentially a rehash of A New Hope. Meaning there is no and shouldn't be one single magical formula that Star Wars should always set out to try and exactly duplicate, when that's never what the guy who created it did or wanted, and he actually actively tried not to do that and complained when others did do it. Which isn't to say I think anything and everything could fit seamlessly into Star Wars, that there isn't something called the Star Wars feeling, though even if it could be properly articulated, everyone would likely have a somewhat different definition. Or that any and every type of tone or approach would work. Certainly there would be some that wouldn't work quite so well, or maybe that wouldn't work at all. But going, as some call it, overly serious and darker in tone and slower paced with Andor not only ignores that some of the greatest Star Wars stories of all time were in the EU and pretty much followed this exact formula, some of the books took Star Wars serious in a way that the films never had before them and were beloved for it. But it also kind of ignores the fact that the franchise has always dealt with some heavy and important themes and topics. There's always been a darker and more serious story underneath the surface. We've always known about it and accepted that. We've always just known how bad the Empire was. But Andor finally truly showed us just how bad, and the only way to do that was to get very dark and very serious and very grim and grounded. I mean, for me, one of the things I love most about Andor is, yes, just how terrifying the Empire is portrayed in it, how it conveys how horrifying and oppressive of a regime it would be to live under, how you fully believe people would rise up and give everything they've got to fight and potentially die to stop them. There are even times it makes you yourself want to stand up and fight evil as well. Flat out, the best thing Andor does, in my opinion, is give weight to the rest of Star Wars, and the original trilogy in particular. The heroic journey of Luke Skywalker means more when you fully understand what he was up against and what he and the Rebellion were trying to liberate the galaxy from, which is not something the films really go into or show all that well. Again, we don't understand the oppression of the Empire as much as it is implied by simply showing us their incredible might. And if anything, unfortunately, in recent times, there are maybe more examples of the Empire being portrayed as bumbling buffoons, more so than competent oppressor. More examples of stormtroopers being all but useless and who can't hit anything or get taken out in one hit, than of them being part of a terrifying military machine that kept the galaxy under an iron rule. Anyway, to start to wrap this up, the point I'm trying to make here is that it's silly to think that Star Wars should only resign itself to be one thing or to only use one formula when it's literally never done that, when the creator himself was clearly against that idea. Which isn't to say certain shows or films can't ever take great influence from previous parts. I love that The Mandalorian harkens back to what initially inspired George Lucas, that it doesn't try to copy A New Hope as much as it tries to copy what A New Hope copied. As I love that Andor takes the franchise arguably more serious than maybe anything ever has before, that it is darker and grittier and more grounded than other shows or movies before it. I love getting some variety, and I try to keep an open mind and appreciate these shows or films for what they are or try to be, not what they are not or don't want to be. Which also doesn't mean blindly accepting and defending anything and everything Star Wars. Anyone who knows me and my videos knows I'm not afraid to criticize when something is poorly written, created, or breaks the canon. But even still, I understand that sometimes someone is still going to like something I do not, that not everyone wants the exact same thing out of Star Wars as I do, or that we're all going to have different opinions or different preferences when it comes to a 45-year-old franchise that we all jumped into at different points. And that if it wants to continue for another 45 years or more, it has to keep trying new things and new approaches, not just be the same old thing over and over again, not just follow one tried and true formula ad nauseum, not try to capture that particular Star Wars feeling you personally are looking for. Well, that's all I got for you this time. And yes, I know someone in the comments will no doubt point out that, hey Thor, The Last Jedi tried to be something new and different and all of that. But as I've gone over many, many times before, the second to last movie of the whole Skywalker saga wasn't exactly the time and place for a deconstruction of the franchise. I am more than willing to see it somewhere else at another time. Anyway, now it's your turn to take to the comments below and tell me what you think about any and all of this, and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.